August 25, 1941, Tehran, 4 a.m. The pre-dawn silence of the Iranian capital is shattered not by the call to prayer, but by the roar of foreign engines and the distant thud of artillery. For Reza Shah Pahlavi, the dream of a modernized, independent Iran is crumbling in real time as British and Soviet forces breach his borders. But to understand why the world's greatest powers would violate the sovereignty of a neutral nation, we have to look deeper than the sand and the mountains. We have to look at the thick, viscous liquid flowing beneath the soil, the black gold that had become the lifeblood of modern warfare. By the late 1930s, Iran had become the centerpiece of a global chess match. It was not just another country on a map. It was a sprawling bridge between the East and the West. To the north sat the Soviet Union, a communist giant desperate for a secure supply route. To the south lay the Persian Gulf, the gateway to the British Empire's crown jewel, India. But the real prize sat in the southwest, in the province of Khuzestan. Here, the Anglo-Iranian oil company operated the Abadan refinery. At the time, it was the largest oil refinery on the planet, a sprawling industrial complex of pipes and steel that pumped out the fuel required to keep the British Royal Navy afloat. For London, Iranian oil was not just a commodity, it was a matter of national survival. Since the First World War, when Winston Churchill transitioned the British fleet from coal to oil, the empire had become dangerously dependent on this single source. If the taps in Abadan were turned off, the Mediterranean fleet would go dark, the defense of the Suez Canal would collapse, and the British Isles themselves would be left defenseless against a German invasion. This dependency created a lopsided relationship. While the British grew wealthy off the exports, the Iranian people saw only a fraction of the profits. This resentment fueled a growing nationalist sentiment, one that Reza Shah attempted to navigate by playing the great powers against one another. As the shadow of the swastika stretched across Europe, German influence in Iran began to grow. German engineers, technicians, and diplomats flooded into the country, helping the Shah build his ambitious trans-Iranian railway. To the Shah, these were partners who did not carry the baggage of British colonialism or Russian expansionism. To the Allies, however, every German in Iran was a potential saboteur, a fifth column ready to blow up the refineries or seize the oil fields the moment Hitler gave the word. The British government watched with increasing paranoia as German agents moved through the bazaars of Tehran and the docks of Khorramshahr. The geopolitical tension reached a boiling point in June 1941 when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa against the Soviet Union. Suddenly, the two old rivals, Britain and Russia, found themselves on the same side. They shared a common enemy, and they shared a common need for Iran. The Soviets needed a way to receive American LE supplies that would not be sunk by German U-boats in the Atlantic or frozen in the Arctic. Iran, with its newly completed railway, was the perfect corridor. However, the Shah remained defiant. He declared Iran's neutrality, refusing to expel the German residents or allow his country to become a highway for foreign armies. He believed that the sovereignty of his nation would be respected. He was wrong. In the cold calculus of total war, neutrality is a luxury that the resource-rich can rarely afford. The British and Soviets did not see a neutral nation. They saw a gas station and a bridge that they could not allow to fall into German hands. The tragedy of Iran's position was that its greatest asset was also its greatest curse. Its soil held the power to decide the outcome of the largest conflict in human history, making its independence a secondary concern for those fighting for global dominance. The legacy of these pre-war years is one of a nation caught between its desire for modernity and the insatiable hunger of industrial empires. It serves as a haunting reminder that, in the theater of war, geography is destiny, and for Iran, the wealth beneath the earth would ultimately dictate the chains placed upon its people. The lines were drawn, the ultimatums were ignored, and as the sun rose on that August morning, the fate of the Middle East was signed in oil and sealed in blood. June 22, 1941, along the sprawling border of the Soviet Union, the silence of dawn was obliterated by the roar of 3 million German soldiers as Operation Barbarossa shattered the uneasy peace of the Eastern Front. As German panzers tore through Russian defenses with terrifying speed, the strategic map of the world was violently redrawn, and at the center of this new map lay the Kingdom of Iran. For the British, the news of the invasion was a double-edged sword. While it brought the Soviet Union into the war as a powerful ally, it also raised a terrifying prospect of a German breakthrough into the Caucasus and down into the Persian Gulf. This was a nightmare scenario for London. The British war machine, from the Spitfires defending the English Channel to the destroyers escorting convoys in the Atlantic, ran on Iranian oil. If the Wehrmacht reached the refineries, the Allied cause would quite literally run dry, and the road to India would be wide open to the Axis. The focus of this intense geopolitical anxiety was the Abadan Refinery, a massive industrial labyrinth of pipes and steel situated on an island in the Shatt al-Arab. At the time, it was the largest refinery in the world, a monument to British industrial reach and the primary source of high-octane aviation fuel for the Royal Air Force. To Winston Churchill, Abadan was more than just a commercial asset. It was the jugular vein of the British Empire. British intelligence services were convinced that Iran was crawling with German agents, disguised as technicians, tourists, and diplomats, waiting for the signal to sabotage the pipelines or seize the wells. Reza Shah Pahlavi, the Iranian monarch, maintained a policy of strict neutrality, but his refusal to expel the thousands of German nationals living in the country was seen by the Allies not as a stance of independence, but as a dangerous and unacceptable vulnerability. As the summer of 1941 progressed, the pressure on Tehran reached a boiling point. The British and the Soviets, two empires that had spent the previous century as bitter rivals in the Great Game, now found themselves in a desperate, pragmatic partnership. They needed a secure supply route to keep the Red Army in the fight, and the Persian Corridor was the only viable path left that could avoid the treacherous U-boat-infested waters of the North Atlantic. By mid-August, the diplomatic niceties had reached their breaking point. British planners at 3 p.m. in London were poring over coastal maps of the Persian Gulf, while Soviet commanders in the north prepared their mountain divisions for a sudden southward surge. The decision was final. They would strike before the Germans could consolidate any influence in the region. On August 25, 1941, at 4:15 a.m., the invasion of Iran, codenamed Operation Countenance, began under the cover of darkness. It was a multi-pronged assault that caught the Iranian military completely off guard. In the south, British and Indian troops, supported by the Royal Navy, landed at Abadan and the port of Bandar Shahpur. The objective was clear and uncompromising: secure the refinery at all costs and prevent any attempt at scorched earth sabotage. The fighting was brief but sharp. At the Abadan refinery, the sound of small arms fire and the heavy thud of naval guns echoed through the forest of cooling towers. The Iranian defers, though outmatched in numbers and technology, fought with a sense of profound betrayal, watching as their neutral soil was turned into a battlefield by the very powers that claimed to be the protectors of international law. By the time the sun set on the first day of the invasion, the British had secured the refinery and the Soviets had crossed the northern border in force. Iran had been partitioned once again. The tragedy of the invasion was not just found in the immediate loss of life, but in the total erasure of Iranian agency on the world stage. The Shah was soon forced to abdicate, replaced by his young son, and the entire nation was transformed into a giant warehouse for Allied logistics. This moment in history reveals the cold, clinical logic of total war. It was a world where the rights of a sovereign nation weighed nothing against the strategic necessity of a refinery. The legacy of the Abadan crisis remains a profound lesson in the ethics of power and the weight of geography. To the Allies, the occupation was a necessary evil, a move that arguably saved the Soviet Union and secured the victory against fascism by keeping the oil flowing and the supply lines open. But to the people of Iran, it was a humiliating reminder that their natural resources were a curse as much as a blessing. The oil that promised to build their future had instead invited their occupation and the dismantling of their government. This chapter of the war underscores the brutal reality that when the giants of history clash, the smaller nations caught between them are often ground into the dust. their sovereignty traded for the fuel that keeps the engines of destruction turning. It serves as a haunting reminder that in the theater of global conflict, peace is often a luxury afforded only to those who do not possess the treasures that empires require to survive. On August 25, 1941, at 4 Abadan, the stillness of the Iranian dawn was shattered by a coordinated assault from the world's two largest empires. From the south, British warships slipped into the murky waters of the Persian Gulf, their heavy guns trained on the vital oil refineries of Abadan. Simultaneously, in the north, 3 Soviet armies surged across the border from the Caucasus, their tanks kicking up massive clouds of dust that could be seen for miles across the arid plains. This was the beginning of Operation Countenance, a move born not of ideological purity or desire to liberate, but of desperate, cold-blooded strategic necessity. The Allies could no longer afford to let Iran remain a neutral wildcard in a world on fire, especially when its soil held the very lifeblood of modern warfare. At the port of Khorramshahr, the Iranian sloop Babur was sunk within minutes of the first shots being fired. The British 8th Indian Infantry Division stormed the Abadan Refinery, the crown jewel of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, with a clinical efficiency. They were met with sporadic and brave resistance from Iranian troops who were caught entirely off guard by the suddenness of the strike. By 8 a.m., the refinery was under British control and the flow of oil was secured for the Allied cause. Meanwhile, Soviet aircraft rained leaflets over Tehran, warning the population that any resistance would be met with total destruction. Their bombers did not just carry paper, they struck Tabriz and other northern hubs, ensuring the Iranian military was paralyzed before it could even mobilize a counteroffensive. In the capital, Reza Shah Pahlavi was a man suddenly out of time. He had spent the last 2 decades trying to modernize his nation and maintain a delicate balance between the competing interests of great powers, but the scales had tipped irrevocably. When he received the news of the dual invasion, he reached out to United States President Franklin Roosevelt, hoping for a diplomatic lifeline based on the principles of sovereignty and the right of nations to exist free from foreign aggression. The response he received was a cold reminder of the New World Order. Roosevelt made it clear that while the United States respected Iran's independence in theory, the global effort to defeat Nazi Germany was an overriding imperative that superseded the rights of individual nations. To the giants, Iran was no longer a country, it was a corridor. By mid-September, the situation for the Iranian monarchy had become untenable. The Soviets were advancing steadily toward Tehran, and the British were tightening their grip on the southern oil fields and the vital railway lines. On September 16, 1941, at 2015 p.m, the Shah signed his abdication papers. He was forced into a humiliating exile, first to the island of Mauritius and later to South Africa. A broken monarch who watched his life's work dismantled in a matter of weeks by the very powers he had tried to appease. His young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, was placed on the throne, a figurehead leader presiding over a country that was no longer its own, but rather a massive logistics hub for the Allied war effort. What followed was the transformation of Iran into the bridge of victory. The Persian Corridor became the primary artery through which American lease supplies flowed to the freezing, blood-soaked battlefields of the Soviet Union. Millions of tons of food, thousands of trucks, and less crates of ammunition moved north across the Iranian plateau to keep the Red Army in the fight. But while the war machines of the Allies were fed, the Iranian people began to starve. The occupation brought about a crushing hyperinflation and severe grain shortages, leading to a famine that claimed countless lives. The sovereignty of a nation had been traded for the logistical stability of an empire. The legacy of Operation Countenance remains a dark and complex chapter in the history of the 20th century. It stands as a stark example of how the pursuit of resources and strategic positioning can bypass the ethics of international law and the supposed sanctity of borders. It revealed that in the modern era, a nation's geography can be its greatest curse if it sits atop the treasures that empires require to survive. As the dust of the 1941 invasion settled, it became clear that the fight for freedom in Europe was being paved with the lost independence of the East. The echoes of this betrayal would resonate through Iranian politics for generations, fostering a deep-seated distrust of foreign intervention that would eventually reshape the Middle East. It serves as a poignant reminder that in the theater of global conflict, the maps are drawn in ink, but they are held in place by the weight of oil and the blood of those who never asked to be part of the struggle. September 1941, the ancient, dust-choked streets of Tehran. The dust from the British and Soviet invasions had barely settled before the true purpose of the occupation became clear. Iran was no longer a sovereign nation, but a massive overland bridge, a lifeline designated as the Persian Corridor. For the Allied High Command, the calculus was cold and simple. The Soviet Union was bleeding out under the weight of the German blitzkrieg, and if the Red Army fell, the war was lost. The Arctic convoys to Murmansk were being decimated by U-boats, and the route through Vladivostok was too long and fraught with political tension with Japan. This left the Persian Corridor as the only viable artery through which the lifeblood of Elis could flow to the Eastern Front. The heart of this logistical miracle was the Trans-Iranian Railway, a project the deposed Reza Shah had built to modernize his country, never imagining it would become the primary tool for its subversion. It was a single-track line winding through the treacherous Zagros Mountains, climbing to heights that left locomotives gasping for air. By 3 p.m., on any given day in 1942, the ports at Bandar Shafar and Khorramshahr were chaotic hives of activity. Thousands of American and British engineers, working alongside Iranian laborers, began a frantic expansion of the docks. They did not just need a railway, they needed a conveyor belt of war. In late 1942, the Americans arrived in force, establishing the Persian Gulf Command. They brought with them the sheer industrial might of Detroit. Huge assembly plants were erected in the desert to put together Studebaker trucks and jeeps that arrived in crates. At 9:15 a.m., most mornings, a fresh convoy of hundreds of trucks would begin the grueling journey north, carrying everything from canned meat and boots to high-octane aviation fuel and disassembled Douglas A-20 Havoc bombers. Over the course of the war, more than 5 million tons of supplies would pass through this corridor. Without this massive influx of equipment, the Red Army's counteroffensive at Stalingrad might never have been sustainable. Oil was the silent facilitator of every mile traveled. The Abadan Refinery, the largest in the world, worked at a fever pitch. It did not just fuel the Allied Mediterranean fleet. It fueled the very trucks carrying the supplies and the Soviet planes that would eventually clear the skies over Kursk. But while the world marveled at what they called the bridge to victory, the Iranian people paid a staggering price. The occupation triggered a catastrophic collapse of the local economy. The Allies prioritized the transport of war materials over food for the populace. By 11 a.m. in the marketplaces of Isfahan and Tabriz, bread lines stretched for blocks, only for the shelves to be found empty. Inflation soared by over 500%, and a devastating typhus epidemic, carried by the massive influx of people and the strain on resources, tore through the crowded cities. The legacy of the Persian Corridor is one of deep, luring irony. It was a logistical triumph that arguably saved the Soviet Union from total collapse and ensured an Allied victory in Europe. Yet it was built on the systematic disregard for Iranian life and sovereignty. To the Allies, Iran was a map, a railway, and an oil well. To the Iranians, it was a period of hunger, humiliation, and the realization that their progress and resources were merely tools for others to wield. This era left a scar on the national psyche that no amount of post-war aid could heal. It taught a generation that foreign powers, whether they came in the name of liberation or conquest, were driven by a singular cold logic: the movement of oil and the preservation of their own empires. The Persian Corridor was indeed the bridge to victory, but it was a bridge built over the dignity of a nation, leaving behind a legacy of resentment that would eventually erupt in a quest for absolute independence, fundamentally altering the course of the 20th century. The world moved forward on Iranian oil, but Iran was left standing in the rearview mirror of history. November 28, 1943, in the ancient city of Tehran, the destiny of the modern world was being carved out behind high walls and heavy curtains as the winter chill settled over the Alborz Mountains. The three most powerful men on the planet, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, gathered for the first time in person. They called it Eureka, a code name for a conference that would define the final push against the Axis. Yet for the host nation of Iran, the gathering was anything but a discovery of shared purpose. It was a stark reminder that while the big three sat in gilded chairs discussing the liberation of Europe, the ground beneath their feet was a prize they were already beginning to divide. The arrival of the leaders was a study in the shifting scales of global power. Roosevelt, seeking to build a rapport with Stalin, bypassed the American legation to stay at the Soviet embassy, arriving in his motorcade around 3 p.m. to avoid potential Nazi assassins. Churchill, meanwhile, found himself increasingly sidelined, a symbol of a fading British Empire that was now desperately clinging to its oil interests in the south. Between them stood the young Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was treated less like a sovereign monarch and more like an inconvenient landlord. In his own capital, the Shah was forced to navigate a labyrinth of protocol, where he was frequently the last to be informed and the first to be ignored. When he finally met with the leaders, the interactions were brief and patronizing. It was a humiliating realization for the Iranian leadership. Their country was the bridge to victory, yet they were not even allowed a seat at the table where the tolls were being calculated. The shadow of oil hung over every dinner and every map spread across the conference tables. While the public focus was on the opening of a second front in France, the private tension revolved around the liquid gold that had made the Persian Corridor so vital. The British were determined to protect the Anglo-Iranian oil company's monopoly, viewing any American or Soviet encroachment as a threat to their post-war recovery. Stalin, however, was playing a longer game. He had seen how Iranian oil fueled the British fleet and the American industrial machine, and he wanted a share for the Soviet Union. By demanding oil concessions in the northern provinces, Stalin was effectively laying the groundwork for a permanent Soviet sphere of influence. The Americans, represented by a State Department increasingly wary of both British colonialism and Soviet expansionism, began to champion the open door policy. They argued that Iran's resources should be open to all, which in reality meant they wanted a piece of the pie that the British had kept for themselves for decades. On the final day of the conference, December 1, 1943, the Big Three issued the Declaration on Iran. It was a document filled with lofty language, promising that the Allied powers were at one with the government of Iran in their desire for the maintenance of the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the nation. It promised economic assistance and the withdrawal of troops once the war ended. To the world, it looked like a victory for Iranian diplomacy. But behind the signatures, the promise was hollow. The declaration was a strategic necessity to keep Iran stable while the war raged on, a diplomatic sedative to ensure the oil continued to flow and the supply lines remained open. The Big Three were not guaranteeing Iran's freedom out of altruism. They were guaranteeing it because a chaotic Iran was a threat to their own logistics. The Tehran Conference was the moment the struggle for oil moved from the battlefield to the diplomatic theater, setting the stage for the first great confrontation of the Cold War. As the leaders departed, they left behind a nation that had been promised sovereignty but was treated as a resource. The conference didn't just redefine the borders of Europe, it redefined the relationship between the West and the Middle East, transforming oil from a commodity of war into a weapon of political survival. History often remembers Tehran as the place where the Great Alliance solidified the plans to defeat Hitler. But for Iran, it was the place where the illusion of international law met the reality of imperial greed. The legacy of those few days in 1943 is not found in the grand declarations of independence, but in the deep-seated mistrust that would follow. It was here that Iran learned a bitter lesson, that in the eyes of the great powers, sovereignty is a secondary concern to the security of the pipeline. The struggle for oil concessions in the wake of the conference would eventually lead to the rise of nationalism, the coup of 1953, and a century of upheaval. The Big Three left Tehran with a plan for peace, but they left Iran with the seeds of a revolution, proving that while oil can win a war, the cost of securing it is often paid in the dignity and future of the people who live above the wells. The world moved on, fueled by the riches of the Persian soil, while Iran remained a prisoner of its own geography, a nation whose fate was signed away in a room where it was never truly invited to speak. September 1945 in the capital city of Tehran. As the smoke of the Second World War cleared across Europe and the Pacific, the people of Iran looked to the horizon, waiting for the departure of the foreign armies that had turned their sovereign nation into a sprawling supply depot. The war was over, but for Iran, the struggle for self-determination was only entering a more volatile chapter. The British and the Soviets had promised to withdraw their forces within 6 months of the war's conclusion. Yet, as the clock ticked toward the deadline, it became clear that the world's appetite for Iranian oil had only grown. The strategic importance of the Persian Corridor during the conflict had not just saved the Soviet Union from collapse. It had taught the great powers a dangerous lesson about how easily a neutral nation could be bent to the will of global necessity. The wartime occupation had left Iran's economy in tatters. While the Big Three toasted to victory, the Iranian people were reeling from a hyperinflation rate that had soared past 400%. The requisitioning of trucks and grain to feed the Allied war machine had triggered localized famines, leaving scars on the national psyche that no diplomatic communique could heal. It was in this atmosphere of exhaustion and resentment that a new generation of Iranian leaders began to question the status quo. They watched as the Anglo-Iranian oil company continued to funnel the vast majority of petroleum profits back to London, paying more in taxes to the British Treasury than it paid in royalties to the Iranian government. To many in Tehran, it felt as though the occupation had never truly ended. It had simply changed its uniform from a soldier's tunic to a businessman's suit. By 10 a.m. on the morning of March 2, 1946, the deadline for the total withdrawal of foreign troops passed, with Soviet forces still firmly entrenched in the north. This sparked the first major crisis of the Cold War, a direct legacy of the wartime arrangements made in the shadows of the 1943 Tehran Conference. The oil concessions that the Soviets demanded in exchange for their departure served as a grim reminder that Iran was no longer a country in the eyes of the superpowers, but a chessboard. This violation of sovereignty paved the way for the rise of Mohammad Mossadegh, a man whose political identity was forged in the fire of anti-colonial resistance. He argued that as long as foreign powers controlled the oil, Iran would never be truly free. The climax of this struggle arrived in the early 1950s, when Mossadegh finally moved to nationalize the oil industry. He was not just fighting for revenue. He was attempting to reclaim a dignity that had been pawned to fuel the tanks that liberated Europe. The response from the West was a brutal economic blockade, followed by the 1953 coup orchestrated by the CIA and MI6. This intervention, known as Operation Ajak, shattered the fragile blossoms of Iranian democracy and restored the absolute power of the Shah. It was a move dictated by the same cold logic that had driven the 1941 invasion. The flow of oil was more important than the rights of the people who lived atop the reservoirs. The decades that followed were a long, simmering countdown to the 1979 revolution. The Shah, bolstered by Western support and oil wealth, modernized the country at a breakneck pace, but he did so while suppressing the very nationalist and religious sentiments that had been building since the war. When the revolution finally erupted, it was defined by a fierce, uncompromising rejection of foreign interference, a direct echo of the anger that had built up during the years of Allied occupation. The slogan of neither East nor West became the heartbeat of a nation that was tired of being a bridge for others to cross. Looking back, the legacy of World War II in Iran is a story of profound irony. The nation's contribution to the Allied victory was indispensable, yet it was rewarded with a century of political upheaval. The oil that lubricated the wheels of the liberation of Europe became the very substance that drowned Iran's own democratic aspirations. We are left to wonder how the Middle East might look today if the sovereignty of smaller nations had been respected with the same fervor as the pursuit of their resources. Iran's modern landscape is a map of these old wounds, a testament to the fact that when a nation becomes a strategic asset, its people often become an afterthought. The world moved into a new age of prosperity on the back of Iranian oil. But for the people of the plateau, the price of that progress was their own future. It remains a poignant reminder that while resources can win a war, the peace they purchase is often built on the foundations of another's tragedy.